Um, that was about HeLa cells. I'm sure most of you have used or at least heard of HeLa cells. I don't know what for those that didn't see the beginning, they were talking about how they're identical cells. That's absolutely not true. Probably every lab's HeLa cells are different from every other lab's, which is why using HeLa cells sometimes causes some issues. But we might talk about that a little bit more later if we have more time. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about the one thing I actually know something about, oncogenic viruses, and specifically DNA DNA viruses that cause cancer. So on Friday we talked about the retroviruses, how they might cause cancer, and a lot of it was through integration, even though some of them did express oncogenes. As a rule, these guys all have oncogenes. Sometimes they do integrate, but it's kind of a flip argument, right? So these typically have oncogenes that might also integrate and then cause issues that way. So again, the rule is that these make viral oncogenes that will alter the cell cycle. And the reason they do that is so that they can promote their own viral life cycle. And as a side effect, is why they cause disease eventually. So one of the examples is hepatitis B, even though it's one of those DNA viruses that's kind of funky. It is the one that has that big gap in the middle. So about 30% of the world population has Hep B. There is a pretty good vaccine. If you're going to work in the lab, get the vaccine. Well, I think it's required to have the vaccine. If not, you should get it anyway. So it causes about 50% of all liver cancers. As you remember, this is one of those double-stranded DNA reverse transcription viruses. So it has to have a reverse transcriptase that allows it to then complete its life cycle. It's circular, but it has that big gap here in the middle where it's not actually double-stranded. And what's pretty cool about it is that this completion of the double-stranded DNA happens once it enters the nucleus. So this is how it's in the capsid. Only when it enters does it become double-stranded. I think we've talked about this before. Typically, once the viral genome gets into the cell, you get this double-stranded DNA intermediate. This is when you start making the RNAs. You make viral proteins, it gets encapsulated, and it leaves. Now there is a side possibility where the viral DNA can get integrated into the host chromosomes. So this does two things, right? One, it could potentially integrate upstream of an oncogene, or it could integrate inside a tumor suppressor, all those things that we talked about before. What it also does is because it integrates, now it doesn't have to worry about the cells dividing and being diluted out. Remember, when cells divide and you have a viral genome that's not integrated, that virus needs to find a way to make sure that it ends up in the daughter cells. If you don't do that, the virus gets lost over time. But if you integrate your part of the host genome, you're always going to keep it in the daughter cells. Okay. Now, it doesn't have to integrate to cause disease. It has, like all of the DNA viruses that we're going to talk about, it has an actual oncogene. And in this particular case, it's known as HBx, hepatitis BX. Yeah, people that come up with these names are not creative, right? It's just how it is. But essentially what HBx does is it'll bind to CREB. CREB is one of the main transcription factors in the cell. CREB then can go into the nucleus, bind to a bunch of things and upregulate a bunch of genes. In addition, it enters the mitochondria where it results in a leakage of calcium out of the mitochondria. This triggers the big 2-FAC pathway, which results in Src kinases being turned on. If you remember from Friday, Src kinase was that oncogene that was discovered in our sarcoma. So these viruses, in a roundabout way, hit that same pathway. They upregulate Src kinase expression. But all of the things they do, so all these pathways, so they do Src, which goes to RAS, CFOS, goes back to the nucleus, upregulates other factors, right? But all of this, the main goal of it is to increase its own viral replication, right? So again, the point is, these oncogenes want to increase replication. The side effect is that they typically drive these cells to divide well beyond what they're used to, which then causes disease, right? Take home here is, it binds transcription factors, makes calcium leak, but it hits that same Src kinase pathway that we've seen over and over again. So another example are these polyomaviruses. Um, Typically, so we used to think birds and mammals were the hosts. Through some work that I've done with people when I was at the NIH, we found them in birds, reptiles, scorpions, insects. Essentially, everywhere where you look, we seem to find these polyomaviruses pretty easily. Polyomaviruses are quite unique in the sense that they're typically pretty small, and what a lot of other viruses do with 2 or 3 or 4 different proteins, polyomaviruses do using this large T antigen. So large T is both a replication factor, it's a transcription factor. It binds proteins and targets them for degradation. It does, it's quite remarkable how this virus has fit all those things, all those functions into this one protein. Because essentially, the only thing that this virus makes is VP1 and 2, which makes up the capsid, and then large T, and in some cases small t. But essentially all the vital functions that manipulate the cell and make sure that it's able to replicate is all done by this one protein, large T. Have you guys ever used 293 T cells or 293 T cells in the lab? They're a pretty common cell line that I've used for a lot of research. The thing, the T in the name that makes them immortal is T for large T. So if you overexpress this particular gene in a cell line, they'll become immortal. There's a bunch of cells that use that particular gene as a turn it on. Obviously now if you're going to use those cells for research, you got to remember that that gene is in there, and that it's manipulating all those pathways that you might be interested in. If you forget what that is doing, it could send you down a rabbit hole. So I think we talked about that last week, where FV-5, which is a virus that's really good at causing cancer in monkeys, was discovered as a contaminant of polio vaccines back in the 60s. And so we literally injected thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people with a virus that was known to cause cancer. That was discovered to cause cancer afterwards, but it seems to be unable to cause disease in humans, which is obviously a good thing. And then a couple years ago, they discovered Merkel cell polyomavirus. If you ever have a chance to talk to Jim DiCaprio, he's a scientist up at Harvard, and he used to work on FV-5, and he tells a story about how one morning he's I guess more old school than most of us. He still gets Science, the magazine, delivered. And one morning he got to his office, was drinking his coffee, and was reading Science, and that's when they published the discovery of the Merkel cell polyomavirus. And he, at that point, called all the people in his lab and said, "We're changing viruses." And so they stopped working on this. And so he remembers distinctly the day and the moment that he switched fields and started working on Merkel cell. So Merkel cell is actually a very common virus. If you look at antibodies, 60 to 70% of us are infected with it. And it infects these particular Merkel cell that I think I mentioned. It's like if you're, like the very sensitive sensation when you like move like over the hairs on your arms or whatever, those are the Merkel cells that make that. And they infect those particular cells, and then they're associated with Merkel cell carcinomas. So we currently think that they primarily infect cutaneous epithelial cells, but to be honest, we don't know. The virus is pretty new, and nobody's ever actually shown the normal cells that this virus replicates. And so we know that it causes cancer in these particular Merkel cells, but it's probably not that it replicates, that's the natural host, or the natural trophic cell for the virus. And so they're currently trying to develop vaccines for this. The problem is, it's a pretty common disease, but it doesn't really cause, it's a pretty common infection, but it doesn't really cause cancer all that much. And if you remember from, earlier this semester, we talked about some of the things that are important for making vaccines. One of them is financial. And so it's unlikely that people are actually ever gonna, market the vaccine. But people at the NIH are trying to make one nonetheless. And so we'll talk about P53 and RB a little bit more later, but essentially, like I said, these large T proteins of these viruses are very efficient at hitting those pathways in addition to everything it's interesting. So polyomaviruses, when they cause cancer, they almost always integrate. And the way they integrate is they disrupt this particular large T. So typically, when a virus integrates into the host, it will disrupt something in the host that might cause cancer. But this guy actually wants to disrupt its own large, well, doesn't want to, but if it integrates, it disrupts that large T gene, which now, problem with large T is it's a little bit toxic to the cell, so the virus has to deal with toxicity. But by integrating, it disrupts that protein, and now it only makes the part that makes the cell divide. It no longer makes the parts that are a little bit toxic to the cell, and that's why integrating seems to be. Does that make sense? So this is typically a tiny virus, like 4,000 to 5,000 base pairs. And then we have obviously the herpes viruses. They're a lot bigger. I think we talked about these causing disease before. So we have Epstein-Barr EBV. So this is the one that causes mononucleosis. It's extremely infectious. It initially infects B cells, and then it can transform them into lymphoblasts, which will replicate forever. Case HV or HHV8, these are those that typically in the normal population won't cause disease, but it's one of the factors in HIV/AIDS. A lot of people will get these carcinomas. So they actually cause cancers of endothelial cells, and what you get when you get those cancers, a lot of people have like these stains on their body from where the blood vessels are just becoming really noticeable. It's very like I said, immunocompromised patients primarily, and it's the most common cancer in HIV patients, and it's one of the factors that defines the switch from being HIV positive to having AIDS. Because these viruses are so much bigger than the viruses we talked about before, they typically have a lot more viral oncogenes. Some of them are these latent genes. Remember, when these viruses go latent, they typically don't express much. They just have a little bit of protein being made. But some of these are actually oncogenes. These things do not seem to integrate. I'm pretty sure that if we sequence enough patients, we'll find some where this is integrated, but as a rule, herpes viruses don't seem to integrate. So it doesn't seem to be that integration plays a role. It's all oncogenic viral oncogenes that are pushing the transformation. So to give you an example for case HV, and obviously you don't have to worry about all these transcription factors, but essentially what happens is you have a lytic. What's the difference between lytic and latent?
Lytic, you pop the cell open, latent you.
And latent?
Just replicating, just staying in the life cycle.
Well, typically latent actually means that you're dormant, right? You're making very little. You're making enough of something so that you don't, that the virus stays there, but you're not making a ton of proteins, right? So what case HV does, there's actually a interplay between the cells that have gotten reactivated to be lytic and the ones that stay latent. And what happens is the lytic cells, some of the viral proteins, will enter the nucleus, upregulate transcription factors like VEGF, IL-6, IL-8. It actually makes viral-like IL-6. What this does, it makes a bunch of factors that act in a paracrine. You guys know what paracrine means? In a paracrine fashion, so it works on the neighboring cells that are not lytic, so that are latent. So these factors are then detected by latent cells that are in the environment, where they then block things like apoptosis, where you get viral cyclins that push the cells that push those cells to keep on dividing. Because remember, that's what the virus wants. The virus wants as many cells to be infected that then can undergo lytic cycle so that they get reactivated. Right? So what this is doing is it's essentially driving viral. So the cells that are lytic are making cellular factors that will then drive the neighboring latently infected cells to become more and more replicated. And so what happens is over time, these cells become too amplified, too much DNA damage, too many areas that don't get fixed, and you eventually get too many cloudy B cells. Yeah, cool, makes sense. Alright, papillomaviruses. So they're about 8,000 base pairs, so they're a little bit bigger than those polioviruses that we talked about. They're non-enveloped, double-stranded DNA. They infect essentially every mammal, bird that we've looked at, reptiles, and then they infect fish, so that suggests that these things have been around for 500 million years, if not more. So they've been evolving alongside us for forever. They primarily infect epithelial cells, so they're probably the only viral family that has made the entry site also its replication site. Remember, every virus at some point has to cross the epithelial barrier, but then it goes into a secondary site where the actual life cycle happens. Papillomaviruses have actually decided to stay in that mucosal layer. One of the reasons they do that is because it's actually a pretty easy place to avoid the immune system, provided that you're able to replicate in there. So I think, if I have said this to you guys before, just tell me to keep moving, because I've been talking about papillomavirus a lot lately. But we've done studies where when you look at college kids going to, so your age, going to college as virgins, and we've asked them to keep track of their first sexual contact, and then we've taken samples to look for papillomaviruses. Within 12 months of first sexual contact, 85% of patients is positive for the oncogenic papillomavirus. So it's pretty good at being transmitted. But most papillomaviruses are clean. So even though up to 90% of people probably over a lifetime, 100% of people have been infected with these viruses, most of us clear it and nothing ever happens, right? Cancer, papillomavirus-induced cancer is a fairly rare event. And the way it works is in the skin, there's those antigen-presenting cells that we talked about. In the skin, they're called Langerhans cells. It doesn't really matter. They're a particular type of dendritic cells. They then activate T cells, and T cells infiltrate into the skin, and that clears the infection. And so what happens is, so clearance can take several months or even years, and for some reason there are some people who are unable to clear the infection. And if you're unable, that's when you become a risk factor for getting disease. And so, like, because it is controlled by T cells, the more susceptible you are to an infection if you're immunocompromised. So HIV patients actually have an increased chance of cervical cancer just because of that. And that's just something to remember. Case HV is in HIV patients. This guy causes more disease in people with immunosuppression. And that all makes sense, right? The goal of the immune system is to get rid of these things that are maintained long term. All these viruses only cause cancer because they are in the host for so long, right? So this is the papillomavirus 3. So this is like, we know of more than 300 distinct viruses, and we've essentially found them anywhere we've looked. I'll give you brownie points if you know who this guy is. Who's this guy? Didn't expect anyone to know, but he's a pretty cool guy. But yeah, so they infect everything. Wild cats as well. I mean, not just anyway, so I think everybody knows that they cause cervical cancer, but there's a dramatic increase in head and neck cancer due to this virus, and for reasons that we don't really know, although there's some hypothesis about it, is primarily younger men are at risk of getting head and neck cancer too because of this virus. And so that's one of the reasons that now it's recommended for men to get vaccinated for the virus as well. Right? So not just to help the herd immunity, because obviously, well, not obviously, but men are most likely the ones that spread the virus easier from woman to woman. So that would help with herd immunity. But now, because of this really dramatic increase in head and neck cancer in men, we're also vaccinating. So the reason why most viruses don't stick around in the skin is because of this weird thing that differentiates, and it's kind of a hard place to be active in and to be maintained in. But papillomavirus have figured a way to get in, and the way it works is you get these microabrasions. So these are not real tears, but they're small breaks where the virus is able to get into the basal layer. If the virus gets too deep, it's in the blood. Now there's an immune response. It doesn't do it, right? So it has to just stay and get in here. I think Sam showed you this slide when he gave this talk about entry. But essentially what happens is the virus gets in, travels through the endocytotic pathway, and then the virus makes it into the right? So it's a completely nuclear virus. You get an initial burst of amplification, so one genome comes in typically as the cells are dividing, and your virus is being maintained exochromosomal. Somehow you need to make sure that your viral genome gets delivered to the daughter cells. So papillomavirus figured out a way to do that. But now what happens in the skin is, you guys know about like how the basal cells are maintained, and then they go up and they differentiate, and that's how you make skin. So the virus has figured that out. And so essentially what happens is these cells start dividing, start differentiating, and at this point you get a massive increase in viral genome copy number, and then you make the capsid proteins, the virus get encapsulated, and then it sloughs off in the environment. But so what that means is that if the infection goes right, the virus never gets out of the skin. And so there's never any blood, there's never any cells it's causing, because they're dying anyway, because your skin dies before that happens. And so what we see actually is when, let's say you do a biopsy, or you do a cone resection of a tumor of the cervix, if you don't take the whole lesion out and you cut in the tissue, and the virus enters the bloodstream, now you're raising the immune response that will actually help to clear the infections. Anyway, so that takes months to years to happen. So this is kind of the same cartoon. What happens, you get an initial infection, and then the cells start, you start accumulating errors, mistakes, until you eventually get cancer. So with this takes, on average, 20 to 30 years, right? There's a peak of women being infected in their early 20s, and then cancer doesn't happen until like 50s, right? So there's about a 30-year window that it takes for the disease to develop. So sadly, that something like this doesn't exist for any other body side. So that's why typically when women go to the hospital with head and neck cancer, with HPV, it's a full-blown invasive carcinoma. There's no nice stepwise progression. For cervical cancer, on the other hand, there is this really nice, you go from normal to SIN1, where you get these, you see these like white halo type things around the nucleus. So that's a typical sign. And so when women go to the gynecologist and get pap smears done, that's what the gynecologist is looking for. So those white halos are a sign of active infection, which is okay. Everybody has them. It's a sign of being sexually active. But then what you get this nice progression towards where you see how this dense layer here seems to like it has gotten thicker. So that's the virus that is driving the cells to divide and divide and keep dividing. And so that's what you're seeing. If you have a normal wart, that's why you have a wart. In the cervix, it doesn't actually get thicker, but under the microscope you can see that, and you see that in the cells how they look funky. So that's what gynecologists are looking for. Anyway, so papillomaviruses make 7 to 8 viruses, 7 to 8 proteins. The ones that are cells, a lot of what they do, and I mean that's what I'm working on, is trying to understand what these viruses do. But I'll save you my research. I'll tell you like kind of what the textbooks say. But if you're interested in my research, I will talk your ears off for hours. So be careful what you wish for. But E6 essentially stops cellular differentiation. So remember the cells. There's this battle between cells wanting to differentiate and the cells needing to replicate. So E6 stops differentiation, and it does that to some extent by promoting p53 degradation. Problem is, if you degrade p53, actually it's the other way around. If you E7 will try to make the cells divide forever, but problem is by making cells divide forever, that triggers FV-3 to be upregulated, which would block application from happening. So then E6 comes in and knocks down FV-3 again. So now you've activated one virus has knocked out tumor suppressor FV-3 and has activated an oncogene by one infection, and that's why these things are so good at causing cancer. So in order to make more viruses, and this goes back to this cartoon, what it needs to do is it needs to be here long enough. It needs to keep these cells dividing, because remember, viruses need to use the host machinery to replicate, and it needs to be able to differentiate nonetheless, right? So they have to re-enter S phase so that the new genomes can be replicated. They need to grow continuously so that new protein is made. They have to be undifferentiated long enough for this to happen, but they do then again need to differentiate, because if they don't differentiate, you don't make a complete virus. And they obviously have to survive. If viruses are alive to begin with, but you know what I mean. They have to remain infectious, I guess. And E6 and E7 help or make the cell do all these things. So without going into details here, but I think what you can see is that E6 is hitting a lot of the pathways that we talked about already, blocking things like blocking apoptosis, degrading p53, which results in proliferation. It activates telomerase. You guys know what telomerase is or does? It maintains the length of chromosomes. So as the cells divide, these things stay long enough so that the cells don't die. On the other hand, it has E7, which creates genomic instability. So that means you're inducing more and more mutations. You start getting rearrangements of chromosomes, and all those things eventually lead to disease. So those HeLa cells, for example, you know how they were saying that they are normal and we can use them to do research and whatever. If you look at their chromosomes, have you ever seen those chromosome paints where you can stain chromosomes and every chromosome is a different color? If you look at HeLa cells, they look like they exploded and somehow got put back together. They are in no way, shape, or form normal anymore. They're completely rearranged. Probably at least in part due to the action of these two proteins, but probably there's probably more going on with those cells than just that. So one of the ones. So remember how the polyoma viruses affect p53 as well. So E6. You guys know p53, right? So typically, when there is DNA damage, you get an increase in p53, which will either block cell cycle arrest, or which gives the cells then time to repair the DNA, which then allows the cell cycle to restart, right? Or if it's too bad, if the DNA repair is just so dramatic, p53 will signal to apoptosis, kill the cells, and that's important for cellular and genetic stability, right? You can imagine p53 is really important to keep the cell normal and keep the cell a cell. So you can imagine if E6 comes in and turns that off, now all these control mechanisms are gone. Now you start the cells starts dividing, keeps on dividing, which can lead to disease. The way it does it, it's not that. Do you guys know ubiquitination and how that targets things for degradation? So this is the way it normally happens. MDM2 is a ligase that will transfer ubiquitin from an intermediate to p53. You get these chains of ubiquitin and p53. It goes to the proteasome, gets degraded. E6 will play the role of MDM2. So this is controlled by the cell, but E6 has figured out a way to essentially do the exact same thing without having to involve cellular control. So by just making more and more E6, you slot E6 into this cartoon, p53 gets turned off. And that's essentially what this cartoon is saying. E6 can't do it on its own. It recruits this cellular partner, E6AP, from E6-associated protein. But the point remains, it's essentially replacing the normal function of MDM2. And so you degrade p53, now you lose that control, you lose that break on incorporating area. In addition, it also activates our friend, sorry, the Src kinase. So Src kinase seems to be something that a lot of viruses like to hit. Another famous function of E7 is the effect of on PRB. You guys know what PRB does? Typical, the role of RB. So RB is one of those proteins that is really important in keeping cell cycle progression going. You know about cyclins? So cyclins are those different proteins that, depending on where in the cell cycle they get upregulated, they get downregulated. And different cyclins will signal to the cell where in the cell cycle they are. Right? So typically PRB will bind to this E2F1 transcription factor, which will keep it inactive, and so you won't get progression through the cell cycle. Now, when PRB is phosphorylated, during a normal life cycle, PRB is released, E2F1 can bind to DNA, becomes active, and you allow for G1S progression. So you're able to go past this phase. Now, papillomavirus has figured out a way, forget about phosphorylating this, let's just degrade it, let's get rid of it altogether. E2F1 is constantly active, and so now you're just constantly cycling through this, even though the cell is trying to stop you from doing it, but the cell keeps on providing. It doesn't matter that much, but E7 does it, and it mimics that, so you lose PRB, and so you keep on cycling. It directly activates one of these CDK kinases. It results in abnormal sentinel formation. It does a bunch of different things. Take-home message is E7 results in aberrant proliferation, which would typically increase apoptosis, but E6 blocks that apoptosis. Together the two leads to immortalization, genomic instability, and eventually pathogenesis. So that's a textbook version of what these two proteins do. I was at a conference about a year ago, and the guy who was giving the lecture similar to this said, this is the med school version, this is what you teach medical students. Obviously the real story is significantly more complicated. So all the viruses that cause cancer in humans, for some reason, are in this one evolutionary related clade. Now, if you go and look, this is not my work, but this is essentially that work that I'm doing. And you start looking at all these different viruses in this clade, it turns out that a lot of these viruses share these functions, regardless of whether or not they're causing cancer. So it appears that, again, like wanting to degrade p53, degrade PRB, are necessary for these viruses to survive in those cells that they've chosen to infect, and that it's all side effect 30 years later we can get in cancer. So these viruses are not trying to cause disease. It's not what they want to do. But they end up doing it because it helps them. It helps their life cycle, and they don't really care what happens 30 years later. And that's kind of true for a lot of these different viruses. But what you can see is that, if you look at different viruses along that tree, that they have different insertion in certain functions. So a lot of oncogenic viruses hit these same pathways, and oncogenic viruses were actually essential in discovering functions of PRB and p53. So SV40, like I said, the large T hits both. Adenovirus, E1A and E1B hit those, and then HV6 and E7 will affect them. So it seems to be that hitting these pathways for viruses is really beneficial in order for them to complete their life cycle. It just sucks that for us, losing those proteins causes disease. So, we talk about this evolutionary arms race. Why would we let that happen? I mean, again, evolution is not a guided process, right? But let's, for argument's sake, say it is. Why would we not evolve something to stop that?
Because we didn't live that long originally.
Right. So there's that, we haven't been around that long, and these viruses have been around for 500 million years. Typically, what's the one thing that we were meant to do as far as evolution is concerned?
Reproduce.
Right. When do we reproduce? childhood, but some people earlier than later. But there is a time point as for as long as we reproduce, right? These viruses typically cause disease well after we've stopped reproducing, and so evolution doesn't care. Doesn't care that we die of horrible deaths 20 years after we've had offspring. We've done what we're supposed to do, and that's all. That's all anybody cares about. So, my last couple slides, my last spiel. So prevention. So the reason why in this part of the world cervical cancer isn't that bad is because women hopefully go to the gynecologist often and get that checked. And so there's a really nice way of making sure that we can keep track of women developing cancer because it's such a nice stepwise progression. Now with increases in anal cancer, penile cancer, head and neck cancer, that nice stepwise progression doesn't seem to exist. And in addition, women are going to be upset, but you can imagine that it's harder to get to a tonsil to take a smear or a swab than it is to take a cervical swab. Never have to have a cervical swab taken, so I don't really know what that is. But nonetheless, it is, from what doctors tell me, it is significantly harder to get to the tonsils than it is cervix. So that's one of the reasons why we're not looking. The other thing is, so people are more and more now doing PCR tests. Any idea of why that could be problematic? So PCRs are, what's one of the things about PCRs? Other than they're extremely specific, they're extremely sensitive. I just said that essentially everybody who's sexually active carries these things all the time, right? So what's happening is we're essentially now women are going to the gynecologist and getting PCR tested, and essentially everybody is positive for these oncogenic types at some point. So they go home, they're all worried, oh my God, but it isn't really a problem. And so there's this point, especially in the United States, where doctors are worried about getting sued. And so doctors want to overtreat the people with certain diseases or with certain infections. And so in my opinion, overtreating women, because we have that nice stepwise progression, we actually have time. If you have an early lesion, in a lot of cases that will resolve. So we have time to keep looking and make sure that you don't progress. Whereas if we start cutting pieces out of women's cervix, it's not. You'll stop cancer, but you also stop women from having kids, for example. So, there's no reason to be overly aggressive. Now, the take-home point, obviously, is there are a vaccine, and the vaccine works, and it will help you with detectable and undetectable disease. I'm pretty sure I told you this before, the vaccine. So this one is the new one that just came out. 6 and 11 cause genital warts, so they'll protect you from that. And then these are a bunch of oncogenic viruses that are in the vaccine. So we talked about these viruses that the HeLa cells that I was playing when you guys came in. So there's natural transformed cells. So these are cells that were infected in a patient, we took them out of a patient and they kept on growing. Right? Then there's cells like 293Ts, those are ones that we took out of a patient and then put an oncogene in them to keep them replicating. So I think we talked about it briefly, but what could potentially go wrong with using these lab-grown transformed cells for doing research, particularly if you're interested into like signaling or anything like that?
Depending on what pathways they're interrupting when they're causing the immortality and the cancer, that could mess with whatever you're trying to look at.
Any other ideas? So one of the buzzwords now in science is reproducibility. Right? So, obviously reproducibility is really important. The problem is, like I said, I have these in the lab, Chances of my HeLa cells being the same as your HeLa cells are slim to none, right? So, but yet I'm saying in my papers I've used HeLa cells where I did X, Y, and Z. Then you take your HeLa cells and you get X, Y, and Z, and lo and behold, you don't get the same result. People more and more are now screaming, oh, you're cheating, you're faking your data. I think people might want to take a step back and make sure that the systems they are using are in fact the same. That's my opinion. But obviously these cells are really good and we're learning a lot of things about biology. But I think you have to keep in mind that they are artificial things. So just some last points. So immunocompromised patients are typically the most susceptible to viral oncogenesis. Now, things like papillomavirus are really good at evading immune systems. All these viruses are making things actively hidden from the immune system, so you don't have to be immunocompromised to get these diseases. HPV has E67. Large T is the oncogene for polyomaviruses. For the herpes viruses, they typically carry a bunch. It's HPX for hepatitis B, but they typically hit a bunch of common targets. If they don't hit the same target, it's the same thing with viruses over and over. They might not hit the same protein, but they're typically hitting the same pathways to do it. And we've learned a lot about these things by looking at them, how they work in the labs. And this is not important. Thank you. Are we having an activity on Wednesday?
Yeah.
I'll get back to you.